It's 3 and we begin. Hello everyone. This is the first session on housing. So we're moving from land to housing. I'm happy to chair this session. I just say a few words and then we'll have the presentation of the research. This is not good. This one? Is this better? Is it? Okay. No, I don't think so. Both of them? No. So what should we do? No, I think... Is this better? Great. Okay, I'll introduce myself. I'm Neta. I'm a teacher at the law school at Tel Aviv University. I'm delighted to be here. I really thank the conference organizers for inviting me. Still can't hear me? Now you can hear me? I said I'm delighted to be here. Okay, so we're moving from land to housing. Obviously, land and housing are connected. In some places, they're more connected than others. I understand that in India, there's a very strong connection between the right to land and the right to housing, but housing still involves additional bundles of interests and rights. When we talk about housing, we talk about habitability in terms of human right to housing, affordability, accessibility, the location, cultural adaptation, housing close to work and education. So it's in addition to questions of property, we're talking about additional bundle of rights. And we have a very, very comprehensive chapter in the report, which we will hear right now from Anindita Mukherjee. I just want to say that this is really a wonderful analysis on issues of housing. So the first part will be strategies for actualizing the right to housing. And I think besides Anindita and myself, there are no lawyers on the panel. So this is something to point out. So please, Anindita. Should I just do whatever you're more comfortable with, but you're going to have to hold this in your... You have no. Put on the PDF. The PDF.
Good afternoon. I'm presenting before this at this panel as someone who is introduction to this subject is rather recent, especially given my August co-panelists. I'm also presenting as someone whose discipline, that of law, has, at least in India, paid scant attention to the subject. So when it comes to speaking about strategies, which is more a question of experience, I do have more questions at hand than I have tactics that we can actually talk about. So my presentation is raising a certain set of questions that I came to as somebody beginning work on the right to housing. And I'm hoping that through this afternoon and evening, we will think through more tactical questions that are about how do you strategize to actually achieve this right. Okay, yeah. The one broad question I think that covers a very large set of questions that I have when we speak of strategies to achieve the right to housing is whose strategies? Are we speaking about rights claimants? In which case, of course, the question is who this right claimant is. Are we speaking about somebody who is homeless? Are we speaking of someone who has a house but that doesn't have adequate running water or electricity? Are we speaking of a person who's built up a house, has got these government facilities but doesn't have title and therefore could be displaced or evicted by virtue of existing statute that empowers the state to do so? Who is this rights claimant and what is it? What is the substance of the right that the person actually seeks to enjoy? Are we speaking of strategies that civil society organizations work towards in, say, framing litigation, social action? Are we speaking of delivery strategies by civil society organizations, which is to say a public good delivered by non-governmental organizations? Are we speaking about the state? In which case, can you say the state in the singular at all? Especially given that housing is a subject whose place within the Indian legal jurisdiction breakup is ambiguous in the sense that land is a state subject. However, the center owns substantial tracts of land across states. You have housing not mentioned in the three lists that define jurisdiction in the Constitution. But you do have housing and delivery of housing mentioned as subjects for local government, that states can devolve power to local government to act on, which would imply they're state subjects but not say so clearly. So when you're thinking about state strategy or you're thinking about planning and such like, can you speak of the state as one individual entity? The third is, I mean, all three are obviously relevant when we're speaking of the right to housing, but I would concentrate on the third as a lawyer. Adya, could you just... So I think one of the reasons why the law has shortchanged the subject is because housing is seen predominantly as a policy issue, which is that you have a moral right, perhaps, but since it hasn't been encoded in the law as such, most work on housing in the context of state action has happened within the scheme of policy. And we're not saying this of course, there's the distinction between social policy and rights that was being discussed yesterday, but also in the technical sense of the distinction between law and policy. We've predominantly seen housing feature in the realm of policy, which is, I think, the case with most socio-economic rights as such. However, the fact that housing isn't discussed very much in the legal scholarship is unfortunate, because the sort of strategies you can adopt to increase access to housing are hugely dependent on the interplay, or that have been adopted to increase access to housing, are hugely dependent on the interplay between the law and policy and the sort of intersections and contradictions that emerge therein. So, for example, if we are to say, and this is a fair assumption, that housing is a state subject, it is something that requires local delivery and particularization, but also within the constitutional schema, it's fair to say that the argument that it's a state subject holds water. Then why is it that most housing schemes and most funding for housing happens at the level of the center? How do centrally sponsored schemes undercut the sort of division that exists within the union and the states? To take a case in point, the JNNURM, which is at its point the largest funded scheme, required mandatory amendments to state statutes in order to access funding. Now, this is a really interesting legal question, because in law, a state cannot, through state statute, undermine a central statute on the point. But how does it work when there is this undermining by policy and through finance of existing division of jurisdictions? This interplay between policy and law is something that I think requires greater thought in the way in which we think about planning for closing the housing gap. The only one context in which there is a clear legal sort of input is where cases go to court, because there is no statute on housing as such. The ways in which people strategize to go to court to actualize the right to housing is of specific interest to me, not necessarily because it actually delivers any goods, but because within the law there is this huge emphasis upon justiciability and going to court, and one wants to think through whether that is a good strategy at all. So in the work that I have done, there are two ways in which you approach a court in the context of a socio-economic right. There's one, of course, the fact that you're facing eviction. There is this process of dehousing that is at play, and you're approaching a court as a firefighting measure. There's the first level question of whether that's a great idea at all, because you run the risk of legitimizing that process of dehousing in a situation in which a court says, yeah, you're totally allowed, the state is totally allowed to undertake this eviction, it's statutorily permitted, or there is a public purpose, or whatever else. But there is a slight possibility of finding some relief in the court system by means of a stay order occasionally, and by means of an enforcement of, due process, which is to say that one must receive notice, etc., before an eviction takes place. The gains of this process are kind of murky. It's hard to determine whether this is a good idea or not, but it's presumably something that would need to be determined on a case-by-case basis. But what is interesting for me in this entire thing is that it is very rarely that residents facing eviction actually approach courts. It's usually people who do so on behalf of them through what we like to praise as PILs. That's not necessarily a great idea, because we've also seen courts go overboard in terms of the sort of actions they sanction, therefore, because there is no party with an actual interest before them, and nobody, therefore, to argue for the interest in question. So you had courts in Delhi, for example, the High Court of Delhi order widespread demolitions where cases have not to do with that at all. So you might have taken one point to court and you've got an entirely different sort of set of orders. And so that's something to think through as well when we speak of social action litigation or public interest litigation as a strategy for actualizing the right to housing. The second possibility is where you go to court for a positive sort of demanding positive action from the government. So that you had the PIL by AHRLN on the right to food, which at some point became a case about the right against homelessness and the right to shelter because of a spate of deaths in a cold Delhi winter. So you had a Supreme Court of India issue a whole range of guidelines on how many, you must have one shelter for homeless persons per such and such area, etc., etc. Now, again, it has definitely given the people approaching the court a toehold into seeking accountability. You've got a commission set up that's looking and making reports and looking at the sort of statistics that exist, which was not there before you filed this petition. At the same time, there is this facade of action where there is not really any action. The costs and the gains, I am not really here to decide one or the other way as to whether it's worthwhile or not, but it's as a law person, I think that it's worthwhile that we think through whether it is a good idea to seek quote enunciations of positive actions that they cannot possibly hope to actually implement. The discourse gains versus the losses in terms of the energy, whether approaching other possible political spaces, etc., is something that one needs to think through. So I'm pretty much out of time, and I frankly would like to hear now from all of our other panelists on the concrete ways in which, especially non-law people, think about actualizing the right to housing, and possibly respond to the legal strategies as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we are now going to hear about policies or strategies. And we have 4 participants. I just want to say that one of the participants is not here, Professor Solomon Benjamin. He's ill, apparently. So Dr. Anand Marignati will cover for him. Where is he? And be a last speaker. So our first speaker is Sasi Shorey, an architect and urban planner, a senior administrator who has designed and implemented many housing schemes, and we were going to hear about some of them.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, everybody. Talking about housing after land has already been discussed is like a pound of flesh without a drop of blood. As my previous speaker has already pointed out, these are so intricately linked with each other that I have to discuss a few things about housing as well as land put together. I have 12 minutes, am I right? We are sometimes told that we have to judiciously use land because we have a shortage of land. We are one of the few countries which is very large, without vast extents under places like Siberia or deserts. And then urban areas, if we, both urban and rural area if we take, urban areas occupy only about 3% of India's land. So we have 97% of land for urban use. And there is no need for designing policies for higher floor area ratio, for compact development, for restrictive master plan rules to be removed. All these things go against the poor. The poor don't need master plans. They need basic requirements of day to day. And if with the argument that we need to have very high density, we already have very high density. It is factually incorrect to say that India has low densities. Bombay, according to a World Bank article written by Alan Bertod, is one of the highest density cities in the world, in a list of 46 cities. And so is the case of other cities. You go around any city, you will find almost whole of the plot is occupied with the building and almost no open space around. So the floor space index or floor area ratio is anywhere from 4 and above, which is considered internationally also a very high density. Situations like Singapore, Hong Kong, which are island states, not even city states, are very different. The jurisdiction of Vice Chairperson of Hyderabad Urban Development Authority is 3 times the jurisdiction of the Prime Minister of Singapore. I think my presentation did not appear. There is no problem. I continue, and if it is possible to put it up. When we talk of size, if we say that we must follow Singapore housing policies, Singapore is one of the few countries where housing from the very beginning has been given a very high priority in policy making. And almost all housing in Singapore, 90% is government owned and leased to them. It is not owned by people. And it is a city-state with a very strict set of regulations. So size matters. A crocodile is not a large lizard. It is another animal. And so is a dinosaur. It is not a crocodile. So the whole biology of places changes with size. In the area of both land and housing policies, India has made many interventions over the last 60, 70 years. As you know, there was an Urban Land Ceiling Act, which you might have already covered. Under that, it was like demonetization. So it was instead of demonetization in respect of money, it was about territory. So de-terrorization, or you can devise a word called re-terrorization, something like that. There are other things which are experimented by many states. I'll give you Hyderabad and Andhra example. There has been policies continuously for regularization of encroachment on government-owned lands. Those, if you already occupy, from time to time, new government orders and structures are notified, and then you come forward, and then on payment of a certain amount, for the poorest of the poor, up to 100 square meter, there is no payment. It can be regularized and you become a freehold owner. In the case of bigger occupants, there is an amount of charge, but even then, that is nothing. Most of the drives for regularization of encroachment of government lands were utilized in areas like Banjara Hills and Jubilee Hills, and the areas were from 2,000 to 3,000 square meters, and they were according to law. So therefore nothing could be called illegal about that. Legally elected governments passed laws, and then under that, and these things are current. Even today, these are being done. Then there are other. Not only you could be allowed to regularize the government land, incidentally that this covered a large number of poor people also. So it benefited at the same time a few lakh people. Even the third-party occupation lands under Urban Land Ceiling Act could be regularized. And then there are schemes of allotment of house sites for the poor, also buildings for the poor. These are done in all states. There are schemes, as you mentioned, that housing schemes, housing funding comes from Government of India, whereas land is a state subject. Historically, the initiative has been taken up by the Government of India, but there have been schemes like Indira Awas Yojana, which was an exclusive Andhra Pradesh government scheme. But then the schemes like JNURM and then Rajiv Awas Yojana and Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, they are very large and high profile schemes. So the state schemes, they get overshadowed. As you know, at the moment there is a scheme of giving two-bedroom houses and kitchen to low-income group people. Thank you. There are, every 5 years, there are another kind of scheme under which people get houses and they play a role in housing policy. Those are called building regularization scheme and layout regularization scheme. They are different from regularization and encroachment of government lands. These are, if you are supposed to build 2 or 3 bedrooms extra, or occupy some more land over and above the permission granted, and wait for another 3 or 4 years for that to be regularized. Now the problem is that the whole concept of layout development as well as housing development is based on the fact that the commensurate infrastructure also will be developed, and that will be developed with the money of people who are coming and purchasing land. If that is not done, people build here and there, and then one day disaster happens. And in Chennai and in Bangalore and in Hyderabad, you find huge colonies, perfectly permitted colonies, in addition to also illegal colonies, are inundated and they remain underwater for 4 or 5 days. I have to cover another 3-4 minutes. There is a concept of floor area ratio. I am getting back from the policy of high density. Floor area ratio has been removed from Hyderabad's building regulation. It has been replaced by a concept of setbacks, height and coverage. Because the real estate trade always wanted the floor area ratio to be increased. And that was changed, and the word floor area ratio or FAR became overnight a 3-letter word. So we use alternate terms. If we say Shamirpet is far away from Hyderabad central area, we don't say that, we use some other term. Finally, I just would like to tell you a few things. In the last 1 year, there is a new national building code which provides in detail requirements for housing for the urban poor, density, the infrastructure requirements. Similarly, there is one model building bylaws 2016, and there is an affordable housing scheme under which you can get private developers to come forward and build small houses. The whole concept in this scheme is to encourage building of small flats, which regular building trade, they only build 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom luxury apartments in 30, 40-storied condominiums. So to encourage them to increase the supply of small and low-cost houses with basic amenities. That is one of the important things. And legal title and easy finance. If we have these 4 things, the government's role is the role of an enabler. Government need not build, because under whatever scheme you take up, the total number of houses built have been absolutely negligible. So I stop that. In fact, what the government should do and what the government should not do, many of you would have seen Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park has been in 3-4 installments. In one of the installments, there is a vegetarian variety of dinosaur, where dinosaur can be both, unlike human beings who are carnivorous. Dinosaurs are strictly vegetarian, dinosaurs are also strictly carnivorous. The professors are watching from behind the trees, and one of the vegetarian dinosaurs has been hit by a carnivorous one. They say that, I think they need our help. They said they only need our absence. If we are not there to trouble them, nature will take care of them. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me now? Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. So now we need to find the connection between human rights and the regulation of floor space and floor area ratio. Okay, so this is tricky. This is the connection between, I think, maybe law and policy, how we treat this type of regulation and how it enhances the human right to housing. So we'll continue to think about it. We'll hear now from Renu Desai, Dr. Renu Desai. She's an architect. You can go as I talk. And working on interlinkages among urban transformations, development, and access to housing. And she will assess the governmental initiatives and talk about what is required to strengthen the right to housing.
Thanks. I'm not very sure whether that's what I'm going to talk about, but just to give you a bit of a background, most of my research, I mean, I was trained as an architect, but most of my research has been in the urban studies domain, and my research interests have largely revolved around trying to understand the interplay basically between state approaches and policies and practices and people's practices and, well, politics, strategies, etc. So I wanted to actually share some of my observations largely coming out of different research studies that I've done that speak to perhaps how this interplay basically opens up or closes constraints or provides opportunities for, I guess, realizing the right to housing, or at least, I guess, negotiating the right to housing. And again, of course, here I'm talking about the right to housing as a moral right and not as a legal right, since we don't have the right to housing as a legal right yet in India. But of course, there is the court process that has provided a way of negotiating this in the legal domain. And so one of the observations that I wanted to talk about was partly the interplay that I've seen occurring between the court process and processes outside the court around housing struggles. So, I think as Anindita, if I remember correctly, she talked about how basically the PIL process has opened up the space for talking about the right to shelter as a sort of integral part of the right to life and liberty, and that we know that there are various kind of landmark court judgments that have come about in this vein, especially since kind of the 1980s and since. One of the things that I'm sure a lot of us also know is that in the last decade or two, we've also seen a move away from more progressive judgments on that kind of platform, an avenue of the PIL, where PILs have become actually a route to where court orders have been passed to actually implement slum evictions. But nonetheless, despite this, and I think a lot of this has happened especially in cities like Delhi and Mumbai, but from what I can see, I'm coming from Ahmedabad, and a lot of my research has been based there, and also some of the smaller cities in Maharashtra like Nagpur. And what we see is that PIL nonetheless continues to remain a very central avenue for negotiating, or sort of, basically negotiating this right to housing. And especially when there is a threat of eviction. I don't think there have been a lot of PILs which have taken, what you talked about as a kind of trying for positive gains, where you're not under threat and yet you file a PIL. There are certain cases like that, but they're probably fewer, or at least less known about. And one of the things that, again, I think as Anindita mentioned, is that, the question has been that is this a productive route to take? And nonetheless, it remains one of the only routes that civil society organizations, and increasingly, at least in a city like Ahmedabad, I know that a lot of urban poor communities know that the court is a institution that they can turn towards through the PIL. And so they often approach NGOs and through them or through lawyers who work on housing right PILs, they directly approach the courts whenever they're faced with this threat of eviction. But I think what one often sees is that, there is relief granted in Ahmedabad. Actually, it's very common to get a stay order on eviction, and then sometimes it goes on for long. But the process that we have seen unfolding on a regular basis in the last 10 years is that generally the stay order comes and then the court kind of gives the municipal authorities an order to frame some kind of resettlement guidelines or policy. And so in a sense, this has been about the right to resettlement as opposed to the right to housing, which, arguably some would say the two are different, obviously. And that whole process that we've seen unfolding in Ahmedabad, where very large-scale kind of resettlement has been achieved in a sense through the PIL process, where resettlement guidelines or policies have been made in response to court orders, and then these are implemented. And so this brings about then this interplay of, the court process with some kind of policy that the local authority creates, and then also various kinds of political processes outside of the courts. And ultimately, I think, given, I guess, even the fragility of these kind of court orders and the fact that, the judiciary can't really step too much into the domain of the executive, etc., generally communities and NGOs have, taken what basically has been given as resettlement. We've not really seen a lot of contestation in the court saying that, these are not the resettlement sites, they're too far, or they're not properly maybe linked to transport, or there's not proper services, etc., that are provided here. And so it becomes kind of a right to resettlement, where resettlement has also been, it's only resettlement as opposed to something broader like rehabilitation, where housing is seen in a much more sort of comprehensive way as this kind of bundle of rights to livelihood and water, sanitation, etc. So I think that is one of the things that we've seen, and also at the same time, this kind of a court process often giving legitimacy to the displacement and the eviction, to the resettlement, and to the larger urban projects that have occurred to basically based on these evictions. So, for instance, in Ahmedabad, I don't know if any of you know, a very large riverfront project that has become kind of a model for riverfront projects elsewhere in the country was initiated. And at one point in time, the Riverfront Development Corporation Limited, which is, it was a SPV under the municipal authority, at one point in time, their website used to say that the resettlement is a court-monitored process. In a sense, almost saying that because it is monitored by the court, it has legitimacy and everything is happening correctly. So I think this kind of legitimacy building through these kind of PILs and the right to resettlement that it has boiled down to has raised various questions. And nonetheless, because this is one of the only avenues, we find that, local communities and NGOs, every time they get resettlement through the PIL process, it is like a victory. And then, in some ways, there is a sense that further struggles around these other entitlements that are so intricately linked to housing will happen after resettlement. And so the resettlement sites then become spaces of further kind of negotiating around other rights, which, and there's a limited negotiation there because obviously these sites are already located in certain areas. They are often designed in, these kind of multi-story buildings, which have no relation to the social and economic lives of the people. So there are certain kind of things that then negotiation does not become possible out there, but other kinds of negotiations that unfold. And on that front also, we've seen interesting things occurring where sometimes, and I think this brings me to the question of also the state kind of taking a more flexible approach sometimes, both from what they consider a humanitarian perspective as well as kind of a political perspective, where sometimes these policies of resettlement under sort of the JNNURM housing that was built on the basis of the fact that there will be a beneficiary contribution, There will also, once these people come to live at these sites, they will take up the responsibility for maintenance and operating various services. But yet on the ground, sometimes these being quite flexible, and the municipal authority deciding to step in, sort of overlooking its own policies and coming in to do certain kind of things because of political pressure or because of realizing that, actually this policy is not really something that will ensure any kind of proper housing. So then you end up with this kind of very mixed politics at these resettlements, where on one hand, there is a push towards putting all the responsibility on the people who've been displaced, and on the other hand, the local authorities still coming in on all these grounds of humanitarianism and political pressure. So I wanted to kind of highlight some of this to show how perhaps it can provoke us to think about this interplay of court processes and processes outside the court, which continue, and what ultimately appears as negotiations of housing rights comes out of these interplays, even where stay orders, have led to not really, in any concrete sense, what we would think of as housing rights. One of the other things that I wanted to kind of bring on board here was something that has been emerging, an emerging concern and interest for me, which has to do with, with I think what, in a different way, you framed this as, whose strategies, and you talked about rights claimants. And if we think about the heterogeneity of even rights claimants, so in a sense, the heterogeneity of urban poor and low-income communities, housing policy has approached this in a very monolithic way, in a sense. The urban poor, you have certain categories of incomes in, economically and socially weaker sections, being certain income groups, the low-income group, etc. But otherwise, policies are not seen as actually, are not framed to cater to the range of urban poor and low-income communities who are inhabiting our cities. And an example that I'd like to bring on board here, because I think this is a very important group that we continue to not engage with at all in our cities, which are temporary and seasonal migrant workers. And this is a group that has remained really invisible, not only to law, but even to kind of housing policy. If we think of policy as the domain of housing rights so far in our country, that housing policy has completely ignored this section of our urban inhabitants. And the question of how these groups even conceptualize, or what notions of claims or rights they have, is also a big question. Very often, because these are seasonal migrants, they do not see that the city actually owes them better housing, etc. They are not voters in the city, and this may be contributing to that kind of. So it's not that they are completely satisfied with the kind of housing conditions they have to live in, but they do not necessarily, that does not necessarily translate into a consciousness of, their housing rights, which among the, just a minute more, which among the more permanent urban poor, we have seen over the years those political processes that have unfolded in our cities really building some sense of people feeling that, unka ghar ka adhikar hai ya zameen ka adhikar hai, things like that. Whereas among this population, you don't find that sense of political claim to the city and to housing. And at the same time, the state, as I said, hasn't created the policies. We are more and more seeing, in fact, that our current policies under the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana are very much housing ownership based, which has been the case even in the past. But there are also issues now with things like slum redevelopment, which I think is beginning to eat away at the informal rental housing also that exists in our cities, which caters to this group. So the ways in which then you may say housing rights is negotiated or housing is accessed, and in that sense some right even though it's not conceived as such by these groups, it's negotiated in the city, is very different from how the permanent urban poor engage in practices around housing. And a lot of these migrants also live at work sites. So, if you think about the construction workers in our cities, a lot of them, not everyone, but a lot of them live at construction sites. And so questions about whose responsibility comes in to ensure these housing rights is a big question where labor, legislation, etc. I won't talk about that. But there are a bunch of different kind of interconnections that we perhaps need to see between legislation, policy, and legislation as in various kinds of legislation. I'm talking about labor legislation here, etc., governance processes, and how one can actualize housing rights in the city will have to come out of understanding how these play out with each other. So I think I'll end there.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Renu. Indeed, this interplay, I think, highlights the many faces, the many contradictory faces of law, which can, on the one hand, be limited in its effect, but legitimizing. And at the same time, it creates a site for negotiation and political pressure, as you showed, and hopefully we'll be able to explore this complexity of the role of law in promoting human rights in this and in the next section, so thank you. You also pointed to civil society and the trajectory of civil society to work in a certain way. So maybe our next speaker, Dr. Indu Prakash Singh, human rights activist and more, and he will speak about initiatives as a civil society activist to strengthen the right to housing.
Zindabad, friends. When you talk of civil society, we talk of Zindabad. So that's why, and this is a time when I have spotted some people really enjoying the lunch they had. So I promise you I won't let you sleep. I promise you that. In fact, Anindita did mention about, and even Renu mentioned about the transient population that comes in cities. And Anindita, you mentioned about the homeless case in Supreme Court and all, so I'll talk about that, in fact, because we have been working with the homeless for the last about 17 years in Delhi and other parts of the country. And when we started the work with the homeless, we tried to look for information in the books and theses and papers and all. There were none actually. And following Tagore, that the paths are made by walking. So we walked the path, And today we've got this book called City Makers. We don't call them homeless, we call them city makers, because they have made the city with their sweat and labor, and they have every right to the city. So it's no more a pathos kind of a thing, that, they are, got no powers, no rights. Today, they are voters in cities. We've got them voters' rights in Delhi and other parts of the country. They have voted this Aam Aadmi Party this time when it came to power in large number. And so, when you're talking of homelessness, I just want to quickly here tell you that, it's important to know the scenario as to the work that we started. I'm sorry, I'll just give you some anecdotes also. Like, we interacted with a child who was all of 8 years as to what he wanted to grow up to be. And you'll be shocked with what he said. When you're talking homeless people, this child in Delhi wanted to be Hitler. He wanted to be Hitler. So we asked why. To which he said, the way I have been beaten by belts and boots of police, I want to be Hitler and kill all of them. Now this is a child of all 8 years in Delhi, nursing not a dream but a nightmare of being a Hitler. Things have not changed diametrically. Things are a bit better. But surely, when Delhi police calls itself India police, they tell the homeless, read what is here. They say Delhi police nahi hai, this is India police. So you can understand the arrogance of the power that these people really have. We have seen the worst phase of all institutions in Delhi. The mire which Delhi is caught up in with the central government and state government fight and all that, I think we have seen the worst of it, and working with the people who are in the shadows of democracy. I would say rather on the fringes of democracy. I think it's been a tough fight. It's been a long fight. And quickly to some other point also, where when we used to see homeless people running at the sight of police, we would ask them as to, hundreds of you are sleeping on the street. Why do you run at the sight of one police chap who's walking around the street? And this person says, and it's all mentioned in the book here, that I'll say in Hindi then in English, Sir, भैया एक पुलिस की एक लाठी के पीछे पूरी देश की ताकत है और हमारे 100 के पीछे कुछ नहीं है. Behind this power, behind the stick, one stick of the police, the entire power of the nation is there, and behind 100 of us is nobody, there's nothing. So that is the kind of problem that we were facing in Delhi. And in the 16 years of the work that's happened, because when I tell you what's happening now, it looked like it's a cakewalk. It was a tough fight. And, we had a bureaucrat. I want to mention him also, because it's a mindset. When, we were talking about shelters, about 71 shelters, to which he said, oh, we'll have 17 shelters. And he made a comment. And he's DM Spolia, he was then Revenue Secretary. He says, Delhi mein thand padti kahan hai, thand hoti aanand lene ke liye. Where do you have winters in Delhi? Winters are meant to be enjoyed. Now, these are bureaucrats. That's why you've got these unaccountable bureaucrats in Delhi. That's why I think this government is fighting the bureaucrats, You have this mindset. And then this chap became the chief secretary in 2014 and 2015. So imagine with this mindset, you're governing Delhi. So at a point when we had about only 10 shelters for the homeless, that too night shelters, this January 2017, we had 269 shelters, the highest anywhere in the world. And fortunately, we've got a chief minister who understands the work, who has cooperated with us and done remarkable work as such on shelters for the homeless. So that's one. Second is, we had the media to support us right from the beginning of the work. In fact, whether it was Ambika Pandit or Rahul Gupta, Times of India, In Express, all these TV channels, NETV and all, they all, Al Jazeera, everybody, BBC, Hindi, English, all, they covered our work. And due to that, we were able to get the support of civil society as such. And again, you're talking strategies. So, around 2008, we formed a network called Shahri Adhikar Manch Begaron ke Saath, that's SAM BKS. And it was through the network that about 20 odd organizations, even Shivani, who's sitting here from HLRN, she was also part of the network. In fact, the network still continues. We were able to get a lot of support from different organizations and all. And I must say here that when DM Spolia put 17 shelters, one shelter was demolished by the MCD. And we were really, and this was 2010, it was 10 years of our work with the homeless. We were really, kind of burnt out. And that's when we thought, okay. And there were 3 deaths of the homeless which took place due to the demolition shelter and all. And so we thought we'll hold a press conference. So on 4th January 2010, we held a press conference. On 5th January, the news was flashed in Hindu and Times of India and other papers. And good starts for us, Justice A.P. Shah, the Chief Justice of the Delhi High Court, read the Hindu report. And he called the Delhi government and MCD, he took them to task and said, how dare you demolish homeless shelter? So before the Supreme Court came in the shelters case, it was the High Court which chipped in on 7th of January. And then Supreme Court came on 20th of January and gave orders on the PUCL, PIL, so for more shelters. And again, quickly to add here, around 2003, we had to file a PIL in Supreme Court. It took 10 years to get activated. So 2013, the PIL on homeless shelters got activated. So when the homeless matters dropped from the PUCL case, fortunately for us, a PIL got activated, which Prashant Bhushan is fighting. And now, due to this PIL that we filed, where I'm also a petitioner, there are 2 homeless who are petitioners and all, now the Supreme Court is asking the entire governments in the states to open up shelters for the homeless. So that's been a shot in the arm for us actually. But it's taken time. It's not easy. And, we were interveners in Delhi High Court because, by the way, in the press release, we had mentioned that we are contemplating of filing a PIL in Delhi High Court. We had also mentioned the press release that we are contemplating of approaching the United Nations. And maybe I think that's what appealed to the judges in Delhi High Court. And of course, we had a very fine judge, Justice Episha and Murli, that is also will be coming here. So we are good stars that they were there. And but despite, and then this matter was court on its own motion. It was suo motu matter. It was not a PIL that we filed. We assisted the court. So 5 years, 100 hearings it took. But again, it was not easy for us. Though it being a suo motu matter, we had to file affidavits, fresh affidavits, asking the government to take up things because that time we had the previous chief minister who was not interested at all. The Congress government was not at all interested in working with the homeless as such. So through courts, we were able to do many things, and that's how the shelters kept improving over the period of time. That's how the deaths also started diminishing of the homeless people as such. Of course, now we have a National Urban Livelihood Mission, which has come in. That again came up because we were able to intervene in the National Advisory Council. And there's a clause of 50 square feet per person in shelters for the homeless as such. So that's something that we've been able to use in Supreme Court case. And even that criteria which Supreme Court used of one shelter for 100,000 people, it came in when we intervened in the Delhi Master Plan in 2004. About 7,000 signatures were there of the homeless people. And that's how the clause of one shelter for 100,000 homeless people came in as such. So it's all that that's come in. And then that clause became the clause that Supreme Court used for the country as such. So which, with the struggle that we have been able to do, the courts have chipped in to use that. And fortunately for us, well, it's been tough. But again, Delhi High Court has not been easy at all because I think, we did burn our fingers fighting the case in Delhi High Court. But anyhow, things did improve, doesn't matter as such, One thing which we realize also is that, we believe in housing continuum. We start with shelters and end with housing. So whether it's shelters, whether it's incremental housing, whether it's institute housing or whatever, it should end with housing. So many homeless people are now able to assert for the right to housing as such in Delhi, other parts of the country. We have, while working with the homeless, it didn't mean that we didn't intervene in the housing issues. We were able to stop Baljit Nagar evictions in 2011. When Katputli evictions have taken place, we've been able to file a PIL in Delhi High Court as well. There was an eviction of a homeless shelter by DDA recently, Professor Bakshi. Homeless shelter demolished by DDA using High Court order. The High Court order only said, please remove encroachments. And then there was a mention of this shelter there. So kindly check if the shelter has proper orders for its existence. DDA and police didn't check it. They went and demolished it. That shelter came up by the earlier order of the High Court. So we have filed a PIL again in the High Court, challenging the DDA demolition. And thankfully, we pressed upon Delhi Urban Shelter Improvement Board to write a letter to DDA asking for a compensation of 25,000 rupees, 25 lakh rupees from DDA as a compensation for demolishing the shelter. They finally wrote the letter to DDA. So I think, it's a long struggle. If I have to just encapsulate what I'm saying is that there are two Indias in the country, not the India and Bharat that BJP Varghese spoke about in the 70s, 80s. There is an India which is all capital I-N-D-I-A, and there is all lowercase non-India. In the top class India, we have the Constitution of India working. We have all rights, we've got all power. In non-India, where we have Dalits and tribals and Muslims and the urban poor, city makers, nothing is working. So we have a uphill task of converting the non-India into the India of a vision. And I personally feel that, well, I think, yes, that the entire debate of legality and illegality, we question that also, because how can people of this country be illegal? It is the government which should be termed as illegal for allowing the slums to develop. So we believe in all that. Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana is the biggest fraud happening, because just to add here that they planned to construct about 683,724 houses by 2016. They constructed, you know how many houses? 710. Going by this, the PMAY to reach Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, Housing for All by 2022, it will require 35,211 years. 35,211 years to reach the goal of Housing for All. Thank you. Zindabad.
Thank you for showing us that you don't have to be a lawyer to be a vigorous human rights defender. Thank you, honored. And you know, there's a second part to the phrase, the path is made by walking, which says that later, the path is wiser than the walker. So I think you demonstrated that very, very well. Thank you. Our last speaker is Dr. Anant Marinyati, a geographer and director of the Hyderabad Urban Lab. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a strange moment for me. I'm stepping in for Solly Benjamin. If he had been here, he and I would probably have argued with each other. And I now have the burden of channeling Solly Benjamin. Let me try and see how I can do this. Just picking up on the last things that Mr. S.P. Shorey and Anindita have said. Mr. S.P. Shorey has said that the only thing that they need is for us to be absent. And if that is true, and there are many of us who actually do believe that that is true, that we should actually not be messing around. It's a complex situation. The people are doing all sorts of things, and if we stay out of it, poor people will probably be much better off. If that's the case, then I wonder if it is perfectly all right that we don't know the answers to all the questions that Anindita has raised at the beginning. Because answering those questions is the first step towards thinking about action. Closures on those questions inevitably means that we have to act, and only if we want to act, we need to answer those questions. So let me step back from there and try and raise a set of new questions and see how we can answer them and see what kinds of new possible directions which might intersect with everything that has been said towards some sort of an action agenda. What kind of a right is a housing right? What are we talking about? Are we talking about the building? Are we talking about the material construction structure within which people live? Are we talking about, when we say housing, 500 houses, 600 houses? What does it really mean? The beautiful thing about the question of housing is that it can only be answered in extremely concrete historical geographical contexts. You cannot answer the question about what housing is in any abstract sense. What that means is that if we have to think about housing in ways that will make sense in abstract discussions, we have to try and figure out what the philosophical meaning of housing itself might be, away from that concrete structure. And I'm proposing that housing is one way in which it's a question of the possibility of extended social reproduction. You need a house in whatever form, only so that you can continue to live, continue to reproduce yourself, your family, your community in all sorts of ways. To be able to do that, you need to accumulate resources. You need some kind of an anchor in the city. In a place where all sorts of things are constantly shifting, you need that thing that you can hold on to. That's what a house is. In concrete terms, that might mean for some people that they want to hang out at the traffic lights throughout the summer so that they can actually sell things when the traffic stops. In concrete terms, it might mean that somebody might want to live on the railway platform or in the stop bogies or somewhere else. Why does this happen? It happens because for a variety of historical reasons, for a variety of political reasons, in the Indian context, I don't know why this is happening. The Constitution has just not addressed the question of housing as either central subject or a state subject. It's a derivative. It's a derivative of land, it's a derivative of finance, it's a derivative of a whole lot of things, but it is definitely not something that anybody is accountable for. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I think politically it is not a bad thing at all, because it allows us then to figure out how in specific concrete circumstances we can use housing tactically and strategically as a site where a certain kind of struggle can be launched. If that's the case, then we need to think about whether it is an individual right or it is a collective right. And I think that it actually makes sense to think about housing as a collective right and not as an individual right. It is not about one body being sheltered. It is about a household being sheltered. It is about a group of families being sheltered somewhere. It's about a collective somehow figuring out how to live in the city and thrive. Maybe take something back from the city to the rural areas, maybe bring something from the rural areas into the city. It's that entire circuit which is very, very important. There are multiple sites at which this happens. If that's the case, who are the actors who make that struggle possible? When does it tactically become a useful thing to think about housing as a particular kind of right, in what circumstances? About 9 years ago, I did a study in which I traveled across many towns and cities, talking to people who actually created a fairly decent level of housing for a large number of people. And in all of the conversations, I figured out that there are basically three things which are common to all of them. One, they need someone who is a good, competent lawyer as an ally. The lawyer is not necessarily going to fight anything in the court. He is going to make sure that the other guy is not going to get an ex parte order. That's the most important task. The second thing that the lawyer does is to somehow try and figure out how to get a stay order, so that once you have that stay order, which in our country very beautifully never specifies anything about what the status quo is. We don't know what we have a stay on. In most cases, there are no particulars. And that's a very beautiful moment, because then outside of the court, you can negotiate and settle it. The third thing, the second thing, outside of this lawyer, the second thing that they need is a very detailed knowledge of financing. Somebody should be able to put together the money. It could be through a savings system. It could be through a chitti. It could be through a rotating credit and savings system. Could be whatever it is. You need those things. You need a very detailed, intimate knowledge of the revenue systems. What is the history of that piece of land? You need all the multiple sites at which you have the tools to be able to create this. You need people who can do that. So it could be a retired government official who is an MRO or revenue official who knows the whole story. And he can spin the story in different ways to your advantage. The third thing, which is very, very critical in all of these fights, whether it is being thrown out of an existing place or going and occupying a place, is someone who has a strong conviction in your right to be able to reproduce yourself decently. That's a political group. They are the ones who are going to give you the confidence that if somebody comes and beats you up, you can beat them back. You can beat them back. Right? It's very important to have that conviction that if we are physically assaulted, we should be able to fight back. And the violence is horrible. At that time when I was doing this, a number of the people used to say that, why do people in some cities sit and talk about Baghdad? Why are they talking about Afghanistan? It is the same degree of violence that we are seeing on a day-to-day basis on our bodies. There is a war going on in our cities, and we need to figure out how to survive within this. There are some individuals who will help, and we look for them constantly. This is the story that I heard consistently everywhere. Okay, if this is the case, what have been the broad strategies of finding the sites where right to housing as one instance of the right to exist, the right to thrive, the right to live in the city, the right to make something of the city, actually has been done varies from place to place, moment to moment. It depends actually on the context. So what have we seen in Hyderabad, Vijayawada, Visakhapatnam? We have seen land invasions. Land invasion was a very important strategy in which the legal support becomes an important tool, in which putting together the money becomes an important aspect. But invasion is the first step. You go and occupy land. You occupy it very strategically. You know which is the piece of land which actually should be available to you and is not being made available to you by a whole lot of people who are turning it into money for themselves. That's one part of it, right? What else has been going on? Regularization is one story that Mr. Shorey was talking about. It has been a very slow, steady process where people do occupy pieces of land and somehow, slowly, gradually over a period of time, put together the necessary documentation, put together the small government order. It's a flurry of government orders over a period of time. Sometimes the government orders contradict themselves. You have one officer here giving one order, another officer changing it somewhere else, all of that. Somehow you figure out how to do this. What is the third strategy? In Hyderabad at this point of time, and I'm suspecting that this is the case everywhere, in a place where a large number of people have actually, in the last 20, 30 years, lost the gains that were made in the 70s, right? Where collective rights of people in slums were essentially collective rights. It's a guarantee that you will not be thrown out. It's not an individual right that is given to you. You may be given a small piece of document which says that you cannot be thrown out here or whatever, but it is essentially an area that is given that right? So, but in the last 20 years, we just haven't seen anything like that happening. On that front, there's been a major retreat. What is going on in most of these places is that since they cannot access, since they cannot access formal financing, since they cannot actually do the invasions anymore as easily, that fight has become that much more difficult. Given all of this, one of the beautiful things that has begun to happen, and I think that all of us should take note of it and see what kinds of new rights can we construct from within that, is what we are calling auto-construction. It's like people are almost like snails. They're building a house around themselves. There are particular moments of triggers within the household. There's a new daughter-in-law coming in, you add a bathroom. The two brothers are fighting, you add 2 rooms. To do this, you don't have money. The government is not going to give you money. The family doesn't have the money. The household doesn't have the money. Sometimes money may come from some foreign remittances. What do? What they have been essentially doing in all of these instances is to find one guy who can stitch together a whole lot of these resources and add 4 more floors. The additional floors are being sold to people at a much cheaper price. And in fact, if you talk to all of these guys who are doing this kind of development across the city, which ultimately gets regularized, because it will involve all sorts of violations of building codes, is that, sir, मैं तो गरीब लोगों के लिए काम कर रहा हूँ, कोई नहीं देगा इनको घर देंगे, मैं दे रहा हूँ. Those houses are the ones where rental housing is happening. So there is a new, very large system of financing, of engineering, of putting together resources, of tinkering with government orders, all of this that is going on in our cities, whether you look at Bombay or you look at Hyderabad or wherever, this is happening at a collective scale, whether it is 4 houses coming together to do it, or an entire slum coming together to do it, or a particular group of people involved in a certain kind of occupation. Together, they figure out how to do it, which then means that housing right is actually something that is getting actualized through the site of work. It's not getting actualized through the site of reproduction. It's happening at the site of production. That's the way in which this is panning out. I think that in such a situation, if we have to think about strategies, we need very concrete histories of housing struggles, but not just housing struggles, of all the different struggles within which we can locate what needs to be done. Thank you.
I don't know how many rights can do that, but the housing definitely can bring together different disciplines and different ideas of how to use, the state can give us building rights, right? So building rights are a great asset if you own the original property. So this is really a site for additional exploration on where the right to housing can take us. So thank you, and we have some time for questions. So we'll take about 5, answer, and see how it goes. Yes, please.
The only industry that now thrives is constructing houses. There's a major incentive for doing that. First of all, in Yashwant Sinha's time, with the first NDA government, they abolished the long-term capital gains tax. So that if somebody can lock up the money for 366 days, he or she can escape all taxation. So real estate is one of the best ways of doing that. And secondly, real estate is also one of the best ways of concealing black money. So there are twofold incentives for doing that. And the situation is that in a state like West Bengal, is the only industry that thrives. Manufacturing industry is going downhill all the time. Tea gardens are getting closed. But that's the industry that thrives, and that also is the base of political support. It is for the so-called syndicates, which are primarily run by people of the ruling party, where people have to pay more than the market price in order to buy sand, cement, whatever it is necessary to build those houses. And these are also the people who organize the kind of violence that Mr. Maringam was talking about. It is these people who hire goons in order to destroy slums, take them over, and throw these people out without any compensation.
Yes. Yes, Professor Bashi.
I have read Mr. Singh's orders, and yesterday night I went through additional material, the book he gave me. And I'm all admiration for the great work you people have done and are doing. And there is a lot of organic thinking, day-to-day thinking, which is different from thinking in the universities. So it is organic and erudite thinking that marry together. But I want to concentrate on two aspects. First, I want to make a small input in case it is needed. There is a UNESCO-sponsored thinking on right to the city. City makers is your word for it. Right to city is extremely complex. It's not talking about shelter, it's talking about space. And control over space is a hallmark of sovereignty. So how do you establish people's sovereignty over a city against sovereignty of the masters? This is the question. For a UN specialized agency to be made to talk in this language, and several people have contributed worldwide to this, so kind of do find the time to look at that. Even architects might be interested in this movement called Theory and Practice of Right to City, R2C is called. And that's done mostly by a trust called MOST, M-O-S-T, which is a part of UNESCO. So that was just a footnote to your very neat enterprises, and I'm grateful to you. Secondly, Anindita, I'm sorry for coming late, but from what I heard of you, I might offer you a slight correction if I understood you at all. Namely, you said policies are rarely studied. Was that what you said? By jurists and legal people, that policies are... But traditionally, policies are always studied and made even in the law schools, studied in the area known as administrative law. The bureaucrats make the policy and courts respond to it. So you cannot properly teach administrative law without studying policy. Okay? It's impossible to me. I've tried to. So we do look at policy. It's such factual correction. Maybe it's not what you in mind. Secondly, what I call demosprudence, that is people's jurisprudence, as against state jurisprudence, folkways. Folk wisdom has made its way by demosprudence, which I mentioned yesterday briefly. But people's jurisprudence, not state jurisprudence. And housing is one example that we have already seen, many other examples being offered. Therefore, it seems to me courts are already, constitutional courts, are the business of monitoring policy, making policy. Sexual harassment is a policy that they made, the courts made, linking rivers, black money. How did they make it? By the way, India is the only country, you'll pat us on the back despite the small India and big India. India is the only country in the world which has produced a white paper on black money. Yeah, it has. It has. It's a parliamentary document. Prof. Mukherjee was the president of India. When the finance minister, he produced a white paper on black money. So we got, but how did it come? It came because of the people's movement, both behind judicial regeneration. And therefore, there is a close connection between courts and public policy. Sometimes there are black tidings, which you look at that happen. But on the whole, there is a movement. The court, Supreme Court of India, has always become a court for Indians. It is trying to be a court for all Indians instead of some Indians. So demonstration is one of the answers that has already been offered by the courts.
Let me see. Okay. Yes, Dr. Fernandez, please.
I have a question for Indu, Doctor. When the state speaks housing, it only means a small house and nothing more. Like Indira Awas Yojana, Indira, any of those, with the minimum facilities. When you speak of housing, you are speaking of that as a right to life, much more than a house. How do you conceptualize its nature today in the context of real estate developers trying to take away as much land as possible, growing black money, etc.? How do you go beyond that housing of concept of housing as life?
Thank you. Yes, please.
My question is partly to Anindita and also to Dr. Singh. Both of you refer to Supreme Court and High Court interventions on housing. And we see that the courts have spoken of temporary shelters. But is there a danger that in speaking of temporary shelter as a basic right, that the other elements of housing may be missed out by courts, and therefore in recognition of a fundamental right, if one may say so, of housing, we may further emasculate the content of that right? Is that a real danger, or are we being excessively apprehensive?
Thank you. David, you wanted? I think we'll have David and one more question. Okay, wait. David, and two more. Oh, you didn't get the mic, sorry. And then we do the round. Yes, we have 2 more minutes.
Thank you, and thank you to the panelists for very interesting questions. My question is to Dr. Maranganti. I was intrigued by your claim that housing is a collective right of a kind, and I wanted to kind of ask you to elaborate on that, because I haven't conceptualized it like that in general, and I wanted to sort of suggest 2 reasons why it would be undesirable to go that route, although perhaps you had a different conception involved of people having, it sounds like maybe more towards this kind of idea of a right to a city and a particular space that you were speaking about. But certainly I wouldn't want to lose the individual dimension of that right, because I think that firstly, it isn't only in familial context that people necessarily have the right, and there are people who do not have families or who choose not to have families or whatever it is that, and so it seems to me that we need to be taking that into account, but also we need to take into account the fact that individuals may have particular needs around housing. And so if you adopt just a simple collectivist mindset, you forget about the very distinctiveness that individuals may have in relation to housing. And this is where I think the individualist conception is preferable in some ways, though I also understand that you might be talking about a dimension of the right, which is fascinating, of kind of a right to a certain type of environment or a certain type of claim around the environment as well, which is perhaps what you're getting at. So I'd love to hear more.
Okay, one more. Yes.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, see, I was saying one thing, that when one talks about litigation on the right to housing, there are two kinds of litigation which are normally done. One is for stopping the state. Hello, yeah. One is for stopping the state from throwing out people. Injunction litigation, and the second is for a positive right, asking the state to build houses or give houses to people. And I think the success which has been achieved up till now, and that too also marginal success, is in respect of the first kind of litigation. Namely, I mean, if I am a slum dweller, I am staying in a slum. You go to court and tell the court, don't throw me out, etc., etc. And that too marginally, courts have decided in favor. But as far as the second part, that is a positive right to housing, that is the houses to houses. I think as far as that is concerned, apart from the night shelter part, there has not been any. And I do near future, especially Supreme Court judges, say that giving benefit to slum dwellers is like giving benefit to pickpockets. You have a Supreme Court judge who said that, actually. It's reported. So in that kind of, you're talking about using litigation only for a limited purpose. Also, just one quick point, that we try to use litigation for the purposes of having a housing policy, who is just walking in, and myself both were part of that housing committee which was set up by okay. That committee met 4 times, nothing, just 5 years, 7 years. And it was really a useless exercise. So that is what, yeah.
Okay, great. So if anybody wants to respond, we'll start from this side. 1 minute. Yes. Look, no time. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Okay, I don't think I can answer this question in 1 minute, but let me just say this. The right to the city that Professor Bakshi was talking about as conceptualized by the UN, at one level, there is the question of how do you make it justiciable unless it is an individual right that can be made against the state. But the moment you do that, you actually lose the radical potential of the right to the city as a moral claim, as a claim on the entire space of the city, which could be this small or this big, right? And I'm locating myself at that peculiar dilemma of when to concretize something, when to leave something abstract, when to make strategically, tactically what kinds of claims. And I'm saying this knowing that a slum and its notification, demanding that a slum be notified as a place which is going to receive certain kinds of resources, is both a case of a group of individuals asking for their houses, because ultimately finance has to be given to each household, but it's also a collective right, it's a territorial right. It's a piece of land in a city that has to be earmarked in a particular way. So I'm saying that the collective is something which is up for grabs. It has to be defined concretely in each particular struggle. And I think that we should never ever lose that, because if we do that, then what we are going to have in the name of housing rights is metrics of how many square feet of what kinds of construction material to be used for which house. The moment we have done that, we have lost the battle. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, there were quite a few points raised. I think I'll just take a couple of those because I think and they were interesting points, of course. Professor Upendra Bakshi surely is always fascinating with his demosprudence concept, which we'll surely use. And just to Walter, I think the point that he made about right to life and real estate. Actually, we talk about right to livelihood also, that where people are living, they also have a livelihood there, So I think right to housing has to be that also fact in mind. Well, there are ways and means of dealing with the real estate. I think there are no quick answers to it, but I think it's like, how do you organize people? How do you collectivize them? That's what is important, in fact. And I can just tell you that, we're also part of the National Forum for Housing Rights. I think, where there are different strategies. There are, we have got friends across the country, part of it. So I would say that we are trying our own small ways of dealing with it, but not that we have been successful, but surely we are, cognizant of it. Regarding other elements of the right to housing being, missed out with shelters, I think, it's how you conceptualize is very important, For us, shelters, that's what I told, Saurabh, that we're talking of housing continuum. We are not saying shelters as the end all and be all. It's the beginning because we had this debate, that, there were groups who said, you're some way diluting the issue. For us, we are very clear, like, if people are dying on the streets of Delhi and Kolkata and Mumbai, Chennai, other places, we need to protect them also. So shelters are bare minimum. But then, if we stop at that, there's a problem. So we are talking of incremental institute and all that. That's important. Two is that we met the Delhi government. In fact, it was me, Shivani, and all of us went. We gave the publications that HLR had come out with. And Delhi government came out with a policy of slum and JJ rehabilitation and resettlement of 2015, where it talks of in situ being the norm than eviction. The only problem is that the policy still requires LG to pass it. So I think that's a very progressive policy as such, which the government has come out with. And I think, right to housing, and Meher, the point that you're making, I think surely is an injunction that, we do use, but surely there are various Supreme Court orders and all, which we have been able to use, like by orders they mentioned right to housing as a fundamental right, right to life, and all those orders are there. So I think we are trying to claim what is there in those. In fact, the Delhi housing policy is one policy which mentions the Delhi High Court and Supreme Court orders upfront. So which I think is a victory for us, that I think we are moving in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Renu, would you like to say?
Not really. I mean, I think there weren't any questions. I did have I think there are questions that you raised which you've answered. But this question about kind of the diluting of housing rights is in this current moment of putting the emphasis on homeless shelters. And I think there is a slight concern there in a number of cities, because a lot of the local governments where, I think Delhi has a very strong sort of network of organizations that are really working on this front, but where really that does not exist a lot. I think the local governments are really taking this and interpreting it as, okay, this is what we need to give. And so in terms of policy, I think we need to find ways of trying to find how actually we can bring in that discussion about the continuum of different kind of housing, where homeless shelter is really just the beginning, because there are a lot of people who have been homeless for, intergenerational homelessness, and who, are but seeing only the shelter as that space. And if I could actually also ask you if you could speak a little bit about, because one of the things that has emerged is that shelters, again, has been this kind of dormitory style and very discouraging of families. And if you could say anything about the Delhi front on that.
Sorry, we don't have time right now. You can talk to him later. No. Yes? Nothing? Would you like to comment?
Well, first to Professor Bakshi, No, I wasn't saying that law schools don't study policy. I was saying that when we study rights, the right to housing, however, doesn't feature in most of what we study in the law school, perhaps because it hasn't been articulated outside of a couple of judicial pronouncements in what we consider black letter law. I did have one kind of point that takes off from what Saurabh was asking, which is that not that that the emphasis on homelessness takes away from other understandings of what the right to housing comprises, because as far as Hyderabad is concerned, when you speak to even civil society organizations, most of them would say homelessness is not a problem. It's regularization, etc., that they're fighting for. So in many places, the opposite is still true. But it is interesting to see that it is that courts are more comfortable with doing things that do not unsettle private property or understandings of property as such. So any other housing concerns that have come up before courts, whether it is even when it was spoken about in Olga Tellis, there is this constant need to reinforce the fact that private property is sacrosanct, except of course when acquisition cases come up, but in housing cases, this is always there. So I did find that interesting because the progressive orders come in the context of homelessness, but are not that easy to come by when it comes to other claims that are made on the right before the court. So that's something we could possibly keep in mind.
Well, thank you. And thank you for being such an attentive audience. Thank you, panelists.